Good morning to everybody. Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is for me a great honor to chair this morning's plenary, Can Science Save Us? The Challenges for the Social Sciences from Climate Change. It is also a great pleasure for me, and I think to all of us, to welcome this morning's speakers, the Nobel laureate Rajendra Kumar Pachauri and Roberta Balstedt. Unfortunately, the third speaker, Sir David King, had to cancel his trip to Bergen because of urgent matters that arose at the last moment. He sends his greetings to the whole audience. The plenary addresses one of the most complex and urgent problems we all are facing, climate change. Because of its complexities, uncertainties, and ambiguities, climate change represents a great challenge for science. It requires new multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary cooperation. Cooperation not only between the natural sciences and engineering within disciplines of natural sciences, but also and fundamentally between natural sciences and social sciences. And as we are also dealing with a global problem, climate change requires new trans-regional cooperation. That means climate change has to break through many of still existing asymmetries in science. But climate change also threatens science's role in society and its historically developed and legitimized ways and forms of knowledge production and knowledge transfer. And I think the question at the beginning of the title of this plenary, Can Science Save Us?, encapsulates this in a very nice way. Climate change puts pressure on science as societies ask for explanation of the problems, understandable explanations that are communicable, but also they're asked for solutions. From all this, one would expect that social science would play a central role in the climate change research agenda on a national and on the international level. Human beings are in the center of climate change. Humans are causing, through their actions, the unprecedented changes of the climate, and at the same time, they're also suffering from the consequences, from the impacts. All strategies to handle climate change, on the mitigation as well on the adaptation side, are about modifying our ways of doing things. All this would require the knowledge social science can provide. In spite of all this, climate change is still a very much natural science-driven, and I should also say a very much northern-driven research agenda. And this is why ISSC, together with ICSU, the International Council for Science, developed a couple of years ago the International Human Dimensions Program on Global Environmental Change, the Social Science Program, together with the three other more natural science-oriented programs, IGBP, WCRP, and Diversitas. So we could say on one hand that we have already made a lot of progress, but there is still a long way to go. And this is why today this morning in this plenary, we will not only discuss the challenges climate change set for science in general, but we also have to address specifically the role social sciences should and could play. And I think we all together have to work to embed in a much stronger and a better way social sciences in the climate change research agenda. We have organized the plenary in the following way. First, Dr. Pachauri will reflect on the work of the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He will discuss the role science plays for the explanation of climate change, as well as for the handling of this global problem. And then in the second talk, Dr. Roberta Balstedt will complement Dr. Pachauri's presentation by focusing specifically on the social science contribution to climate change research. She will address in her talk the implications and the challenges of climate change research for the social sciences. After both presentations, we open the floor for discussion, and I would like to encourage you to take this opportunity to have these leaders of climate change research agendas in international setting here, to ask them questions, to make comments. But first of all, let me allow to introduce the first speaker. And I had to work hard to summarize your life in a couple of sentences, so I will try. Rajendra Kumar Pauchari is since 2002 the chair, as you all know, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. He was trained as an industrial engineer and got 2 PhDs at the University of North Carolina in the US, one in industrial engineering and one in economics. So he started already as being a multidisciplinary researcher. He holds several managerial positions and worked also at different universities before he joined TERI as director in 1981. And since 2001, he is the Director General of TERI. TERI, the Tata Energy Research Institute in New Delhi, does original work and provides professional support in the areas of energy, environment, forestry, biotechnology, and the conservation of natural resources to government departments, institutions, and corporate organizations worldwide. Dr. Pauchari has been active in several international forums dealing with the subject of climate change and its policy dimension. I think he's one of those who really thought through the relation between science and policy, between science and practice. To acknowledge his immense contribution to the field of environment, he received in 2008 the second highest civilian award in India, the Padma Vibhushan. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing this correctly. And as you all know, in December 2007, Dr. Pauchari accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the IPCC, along with co-recipient Al Gore. So welcome again here in Bergen. Welcome to the World Social Science Forum, and thank you for joining this conference and giving us a presentation that reflects on your very profound experience on how to relate science to policy, on how to embed social sciences in this very complex research agenda. Thank you again, and I think we owe him an applause.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. I'm delighted to be here in this beautiful city of Bergen, with the weather being as pleasant as it is. I must say that it's really the Norwegian Nobel Committee that drew the link between science and social sciences by, as you reminded us, awarding the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 to the IPCC and Mr. Al Gore. And I was privileged to share that occasion. But I think that really made a profound impact worldwide in sensitizing society everywhere on the globe to the social science dimensions of climate change, and in particular, the threat that climate change represents to peace and security across the globe. And what I'm attempting to do in this very brief presentation is essentially to show some of the gaps that exist in our knowledge, and therefore how these gaps present a challenge to social scientists in being able to address some of the major issues that impinge on all forms of human behavior while dealing with the enormous complexity of climate change. I would rely essentially on the findings of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. We are now at the stage where we are planning and actively developing the blueprint for the fifth assessment report, where I hope social scientists will participate on a much larger scale than has been the case in previous assessments. So let me first tell you a little bit about what one could interpret as the main role of the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. and this really applies to all the reports of the IPCC that have been completed so far. They do represent a wake-up call for action. And this is something which I believe is unique to the IPCC and its mandate. Just to remind us, the IPCC was established in 1988, and this was on the basis of a resolution by the UN General Assembly, where the UN endorsed the action of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme in jointly establishing the IPCC to provide international coordinated scientific assessments of the magnitude, the timing, and the potential environmental and socio-economic impact of climate change and realistic response strategies. So it was there in the original design of the establishment of the IPCC that the social and the socio-economic impacts of climate change should be gone into thoroughly. But to be quite honest, we have really not lived up to the expectations and the mandate adequately. And there is need, I believe now, to do much more in respect of the socio-economic aspects of climate change. And one important lesson that we get from the history of the IPCC and how it has functioned and has been able to influence thinking and action across the world is in respect of how it's been able to highlight an area where all of human society is going to be affected. And this we've been able to do by creating understanding of the interrelationships between human actions and the environment, by assessing future impacts and the key vulnerabilities in different parts of the world, and also by defining possible scenarios of action and their consequences. It's one thing to look at what is happening in the field of climate change and what the history of climate change has been in respect of the way climate change has taken place and the manner in which it's had impacts across the globe. But it's quite another to be able to come up with assessments that give you a projection of the future, because this is what will really impel human society to take action. And action necessarily would involve a major involvement of the social sciences, because in the absence of that, we would be left with nothing more than just the scientific initiatives that are required, essentially confined to the research, development, and related areas of activity. I also want to highlight some aspects of the IPCC strengths. It's a unique organization because we've been able to mobilize thousands of multidisciplinary experts worldwide. All our findings are policy relevant. In fact, our mandate is very clear that whatever we assess should not be policy prescriptive, but it must be policy relevant. And the prescription is really left to the negotiating committee. And at the moment, as you're aware, the negotiators from all over the world who are part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change are discussing the content and direction of the agreement that we hope will come into place in Copenhagen when the Conference of the Parties of these countries will take place in Copenhagen. We also know that our methodological reports have been very useful. Methodologies, for instance, based on how do you calculate the emissions of greenhouse gases? I mean, what generates them? And those methodologies really give you the tools and techniques by which governments and, of course, even regions in countries can assess what their contribution is to this problem and what could be done to bring about solutions. One important aspect of the way we function is that all our reports are carefully peer-reviewed, and they are based on literature which is peer-reviewed as well. And therefore, what we know from experience is that this is a remarkable combination of scientific expertise, which is brought to bear on our reports in a very transparent, very objective, open manner. But the most important thing is that the review process also involves experts and governments. And may I mention, finally, when the summary for policymakers of any report of the IPCC is finalized and accepted and approved, governments approve of it literally word by word. And I can tell you, if you're chairing one of those sessions, it's a huge torture to be able to go through. But at the end of the day, the strength of the IPCC lies in the fact that we mobilize the best science that is available, but we also get a buy-in from governments. And I don't want to decry this involvement of governments in accepting the summary for policymakers, because that's the one document that's going to be read and acted on by governments. And I can tell you, scientists are not always the best communicators. And when it comes to governments, they know exactly how to use the nuances of language by which you can put across a scientific fact, a scientific finding, in a manner that really takes on a significance for policymakers. So I think overall we are combining the strengths not only of pure science, applied science, but also policy making and the expertise in the area of policy making. And I suppose that's one reason why there has been a significant level of success in the work of the IPCC. I believe, and this is one thing that I've pursued quite relentlessly since I've been associated in decision making in the IPCC. I started first as a vice chair in 1997, and my major responsibility, which I took on essentially through voluntary action, was to see that we come up with an outreach strategy. Because I believe if you want to influence the social sciences and decision makers in particular, then it's not enough to produce the best assessments of the scientific aspects of climate change, but also to be able to spread the message, to be able to spread the word that comes out of the findings of the IPCC. And we find that as a result, we have certainly had a major impact in informing the public all over the world and also leaders in several countries. Now, this little chart shows you how English language newspaper coverage of climate change has grown over a period of time. And certainly, as you would observe, the most phenomenal increase has been since the fourth assessment report of the IPCC came out. I also want to tell you about the impact that we've had on the official process of negotiations. And here again, I want to highlight the fact that if we are conscious of the fact that our scientific findings are going to be used for the purpose of defining decisions and actions that need to be taken by society, then we have to ensure that there is some connection between the output of a scientific body like the IPCC and the social science disciplines and decision-making sectors or decision-making organizations across the world. And I want to give you a small little anecdote. We were to complete the synthesis report of the IPCC, the fourth assessment report, in November of 2007. And that happened to be the month when the 13th conference of the parties was to take place in Bali. And this clearly would have been a missed opportunity because we would be completing the report just about the time when this major meeting was going to take place in Bali. So we requested the Conference of the Parties, the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to postpone their meeting by 4 weeks so that the synthesis report of the IPCC would be available to the negotiators. And that essentially embodied the latest in science, which we felt was essential as a precondition for the negotiators to come up with at least a roadmap on how an agreement would be reached in Copenhagen. So here may I say that it's not enough to merely bring out knowledge on a subject like climate change. You also need to see that that knowledge acts on a timely basis as an input for decision making. And I think we were able to do that, as a result of which The roadmap that came out of Bali, known as the Bali Action Plan, had liberal and extensive reference to the findings of the IPCC Fourth Assessment Report, and it had a major impact in defining action that took place over there. In September 2007, this is when all the three working group reports of the IPCC had come out. The UN Secretary General had organized a major event in New York where there were roughly 80 heads of state or government. There were officials from over 150 countries. And I think the IPCC reports had a major impact in seeing that all the leaders who were there but one, and I can tell you after the talk who that single leader was in favor of taking action. It's not the one you're thinking about. That would make two really, not one. So let me correct myself, yeah. But it had a major impact in seeing that all the leaders who had collected over there said that action is essential and urgent. So the point I'm trying to highlight is that it's extremely important for the scientific community to develop the ability and also put in the effort by which scientific findings are disseminated on an extensive scale. Now, I'll quickly run through some observed changes in the climate system, and I'd like to highlight some of the social science dimensions. Well, firstly, if you look at observed changes in temperature, which is the topmost part of this graph, you would observe that there have been changes since industrialization began, because this goes back in time to that period when industrialization was essentially initiated. And there are ups and downs in this graph. And the reason for that is that the climate of the Earth changes because of natural factors, solar activity, volcanic activity, and so on. But we find that it also changes, and on this now we have very conclusive and very accurate evidence as a result of human actions. Now, what is significant is to see that in the last 5 decades, if you look at that topmost diagram, there's been a very sharp increase in temperatures. And that's where human impacts of climate change or the human cause behind climate change has become extremely prominent. And we're on a path where you see climate change really becoming much faster over time. And therefore, it's absolutely critical that we bring about a reduction in emissions and stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. Just to give you a number, at the beginning of industrialization, there were 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. Today, they are well in excess of about 385 parts per million. So we have altered the atmosphere of the globe to an extent, and this is just one gas, of course, the most prominent of the greenhouse gases, but there are several others where concentration levels have gone up substantially. As a result of warming of the oceans, which are expanding, and the melting of the bodies of ice, and being in Norway, you're fully aware of what's happening in the Arctic region, we have sea level rise, which averaged during the 20th century about 17 centimeters. Now, I want to just elaborate on this fact. Perhaps one doesn't have to worry about sea level rise if you're on high ground and you're far away from the sea. But if you're living in the Maldives Islands, or if you're in Bangladesh, then this really represents a peril for your very existence. And you can imagine the psychological impact of this kind of problem. In 1997, we had a plenary session of the IPCC in the Maldives, and the then President Gayoom, addressed us, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding this meeting today, 10 years ago was under 1.5 feet of water." And you really don't have to wait till submergence takes place in these areas, the low-lying areas. Whenever there's a storm surge, whenever there's a cyclone, whenever there's an event that essentially brings water onshore, it just becomes far more severe if sea level rise is going to be part of that problem. We went for a walk in Bergen yesterday, in the old part of the town, and I was told about the threat to some of the beautiful shops that you have over there with curios and tourist items. Every time there is a storm surge, you have water coming in, and with sea level rise, my friends and colleagues over here in the Bjerknes Center have clearly estimated what the threat to that region would be. So sea level rise is something that is going to affect several parts of humanity and several regions of the world. And we need to worry about that even before there is the real danger of complete submergence. The bottommost diagram gives you a picture of how bodies of ice in the northern hemisphere have been getting reduced. There are major precipitation changes that are taking place across the globe, and the frequency of heavy precipitation events has increased over most land areas, including over here in Norway. I was given a fascinating presentation this morning by the Bjerknes Center. And you can imagine this requires a major revamping of all kinds of human systems. This is a picture, let's say, from a major cloudburst that we had in the city of Mumbai in 2005, where 1 million people lost their homes and several people lost their lives because they were stranded overnight in the water, which had accumulated several feet high. And you can't roll down your windows in a car if you're stranded in a car. And if the water was high and you were not strong enough to open the door, then you were just stuck over there, and several people really got suffocated as a result. Now, the point I'm making is that we need to set in place adaptation measures, early warning systems, and we certainly need to improve drainage infrastructure, whereby events of this nature, which perhaps happened once in 50 years and are now going to take place once in 5 to 7 years or whatever, will need to be taken into account in designing and revamping the infrastructure that we have. So this is an important issue which involves so many human lives that the social science disciplines must come to grips with some of these events which are going to become far more frequent. The proportion of tropical cyclones reaching high intensity has increased. Last year we had this cyclone called Nargis in Myanmar, which killed about 100,000 people, devastated a large number of homes. But in instances like this, you need early warning systems. You certainly need relief measures that are in place that, again, if these events are going to become far more frequent than they've been in the past, then I think human society has to respond adequately to these anticipated changes. Heat waves have gone up, and you know that the heat wave in Europe in 2003 took something like 35,000 lives. At the same time, in developing countries, this happens on a regular basis. And unfortunately, there are no early warning systems. There is no means by which you can tell people what to do in the event of a massive and long duration heat wave. So people don't even know simple things like oral rehydration therapy by which perhaps their lives could be saved. So I think here again you need to engineer human systems by which one can adapt to some of these changes. What are the other expected social impacts of climate change? Well, there are various estimates of the costs of these impacts. And to be quite honest, it's not entirely proper or possible to come up with an economic assessment of impacts, because when you're dealing with issues of morbidity and mortality, how can you place a dollar value on that? But there are these ranges of estimates whereby you can say that anything from 1.5 to 20% of the GDP would be lost if doubling of CO2 concentration takes place. But I would like to say that this is only a very tentative figure. It's entirely possible and I would say probable that it would be much higher. We also know that the cost could be anywhere from US dollars 10 to 350 per ton of carbon. And therefore, I think we need to price carbon in such a way that it brings about a shift to low carbon technologies, products, and processes. And one of the major findings that we have in the IPCC fourth assessment report for policymakers is to place a price on carbon. Now, how you do it, whether it's through taxation or cap and trade measures or through regulation, is an issue for governments to decide. There are variations which can be explained by uncertainties in climate sensitivity, discount rates, and so on. So this is an area which is, of course, worthy of substantial research, particularly from economists. And the aggregate estimates really mask significant differences in impacts across sectors and regions. One unfortunate reality is the fact that those who are going to be the worst victims of climate change are the ones who are the least responsible for having caused the problem. And this is essentially the poorest regions of the world who really don't have the means or the wherewithal by which they can take care of themselves and ensure that they don't suffer the impacts of climate change. Just to give you some numbers, people exposed to increased water stress by 2020, I'll just focus on Africa. There are likely to be 75 to 250 million people in Africa who would suffer from water stress on account of climate change. In the case of agriculture, and particularly where you have rain-fed agriculture, the danger is that, or the possibility is that 50% decline in yields would take place in several parts of Africa. Now, these are regions which are already malnourished. They don't have the monetary capability to be able to import large-scale food grains for their own consumption, and therefore they would certainly be the worst sufferers of some of these impacts of climate change. I also want to mention the fact that there would be a threat to security and stability in human communities, simply because whenever you have to fight for resources that are getting more and more scarce, then obviously you have in that situation the seed of conflict. And I suppose this is one reason why the Norwegian Nobel Committee gave us the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Ethnic conflicts can be linked to competition over increasingly scarce natural resources. And the numbers of environmental refugees could increase substantially. And you could have hundreds of millions of people who would be affected as a result. So this clearly is a human problem that we cannot ignore, and we have to prepare for, both in terms of adapting to some of the inevitable impacts of climate change, but also at the global level, taking action by which we drastically bring about a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. What is the role? And I'll just come to the conclusion of what I wanted to say. Adaptation to climate change and promotion of sustainable development clearly share common goals and determinants. And this would involve access to resources on an equitable basis. Stocks of human and social capital need to be created. We need access to risk-sharing mechanisms, and this is where I think access to insurance policies and insurance arrangements would make an enormous difference. We need to create institutional capacity, and this has to be done at the grassroots level, in the governance of local bodies, because it is only then that human societies would be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And it's critically important that the manner in which economic development takes place integrates climate change in whatever is going to be done. We need to assess the impacts and vulnerabilities, and this essentially requires that we have to look at the impacts on human systems. Vulnerabilities to climate change depend considerably on relatively specific geographical and sectoral contexts, and this is true of Norway as it is true of any other part of the world. One area in which, unfortunately, the global community has failed, in my view, is in defining the level that could be considered as a dangerous level of climate change. And this, incidentally, is the central core of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into existence in 1992. But in all these 17 years, there really hasn't been an effort by which the negotiating community could decide what represents a dangerous level of climate change. That's something which science can't do. Science can only provide information on the basis of which value judgments can be exercised to say that, 2 degrees increase in temperature, 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, or whatever. But we have to define what it is that the world regards as dangerous. We really need equitable mitigation efforts, and Article 3 of the Framework Convention states that parties should protect the climate system on the basis of equity in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities. And this meant that the developed countries were to take the first steps. But I'm sorry to observe, and this is purely a personal opinion, that this has not really happened. A number of developed countries have not done enough. And equity can be elaborated in terms of distributing the costs of mitigation, distributing future emission points, and of course also on the basis of the impacts of climate change. Now this is an area where I think social scientists really have to get active. How do you provide a framework on the basis of which we can define action that needs to be taken on an efficient and equitable basis? So I'm leaving that as an area where much work needs to be done. We also have to come up with new development pathways, because the dominant path to industrialization has been essentially an increase in energy intensity and therefore high greenhouse gas emissions. If we want to bring about a change, we need to change the economic structure itself, the geographical distribution of activities, consumption patterns, and I would say lifestyle changes are very important. I have been criticized a lot. I get a lot of hate mail because I speak to audiences and tell them that all of you must eat less meat. And I'm not saying that you become vegetarians, but I tell audiences that if you eat less meat, you will be healthier and so would the planet. And I got one mail from a deeply offended individual who said that, I'm essentially a vegetarian. I do take seafood occasionally. And he said, the problem with you is you're undernourished, so your brain is not getting enough nourishment. But these are occupational hazards that you have to learn to accept. I also offended the mayor of London, the Honorable Boris Johnson, who wrote an op-ed piece article in the Daily Telegraph saying, no, Dr. Pachauri, I'll gorge myself with even more meat, and I'll eat much more. I'm not going to cut down on my meat consumption and so on. So I had to send a response to that, and I said, well, I believe the mayor of London cycles to work. If he's going to eat more meat, he'll probably have to cycle a lot more. And who knows, his intentions may be that he wants to compete in the Olympics that are going to be held in his city. So, that's the kind of thing that does offend people, but I believe that we really need to look at lifestyle changes with some degree of seriousness. And finally, this is a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi, and I want to end by showing you a very brief video of the fact that when we talk about changes in the paradigm of development, we can think in terms of combining science and technology and the latest developments that are taking place in the field to bring about an improvement in the welfare of some of the most underprivileged people across the globe. So I would request that the video may please be screened. This is just 3 minutes, and I hope this will convey what I've been trying to express in the time that you've given me the privilege of addressing you. So we can see the video now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you very much for this inspiring talk, Mr. Pachauri. You know, not only showed us or tried to describe in a few minutes, we gave you the social, political, and economic impacts of climate change. I think particularly the last part also showed us that this is that emotional dimension of climate change or of the dealing of this problem, as we all have to make decisions on the world we want to live in. And in this also the motto of the World Social Science Forum, One Planet, World Apart, applies, in the sense that you also showed us that those populations or those societies on our planet that have contributed less to climate change are those that are now in a most vulnerable position. You also addressed the role of science in producing knowledge, but also translating the knowledge, linking science and policy. And the next speaker, Roberta Ballstedt, now will go a little bit more in depth into the question what climate change means for social sciences, what are the challenges for social sciences. I think Mr. Pachauri highlighted quite well the centrality social sciences should have in addressing this issue. But I will first like to introduce with a few words Roberta. Roberta Ballstedt is Senior Fellow and former Director of the Center for International Earth Science Information Network, CESIN, at Columbia University. CESIN works at the intersection of the societal, natural, and information sciences and specializes in online data and information management, spatial data integration and training, and interdisciplinary research related to human interactions in the environment. But Roberta Ballstedt is further co-director of the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions at the same university, and she works extensively in a broad range of commissions and boards, and I can only mention here one, which is also of relevance for ISSC, which is she's the chair of the US National Committee on Data for Sciences and Technology CoData. She received a PhD in history from the University of Minnesota and was previously the director of the Division of Social and Economic Sciences at the NSF, the US National Science Foundation, so she can also give us some insights on what this means for research policies, which I think is an important issue, because without money, social sciences cannot do the work they have to do in order to play a role in climate change. And she published extensively on science policy, information technology, and scientific research, human interactions in the environment, and remote sensing applications and policy. Thank you, Roberta, for conveying now your thoughts on this issue.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm very pleased to be here today. I want to thank Gudmund Hernes, Heidi Hartmann, the ISSC for organizing this meeting. But I'm also pleased to be here because it is honoring Stein Rokan. And I can remember when I was in graduate school, Stein Rokan visited the University of Minnesota. And in that small academic, secular environment, it was a little bit like a visit of the Pope. So I'm very, very happy to take part in this meeting. My focus this morning is going to be more on the social sciences, and I think it fits in quite well with Dr. Pachauri's very broad-based presentation about the importance of the research fields, the development of policy, the communication of information about scientific consensus. There's no question that the social sciences have a critical role to play in climate change research. As we have heard from Dr. Pachauri this morning, Climate scientists recognize the value of the social science contribution to their work, and in recent years, with the disappearance of any credible objections to the existence of climate change, with the growing emphasis upon adaptation and mitigation, there's a deepening appreciation within many national research agencies, within research communities, of the importance of a social science contribution to climate research. In part, this is because of the assumption that climate policy is something that falls naturally into the domain of the social sciences. But it also reflects a growing consensus that neither the physical nor the biogeochemical sciences can do this alone. They need the social sciences. The situation today is that there is a widely acknowledged need for social science, and there is a broad recognition of its importance. The challenge is whether the social sciences are capable of meeting this need. For despite a sustained emphasis upon climate and environmental research within the social science community over a number of years, and despite the involvement of excellent social scientists in this research, the overall scientific contribution of the social sciences to climate change have been less than many would have hoped. To date, climate change research remains a small specialty within the social sciences. Climate scientists continue to call for more involvement of social scientists in their work, and the potential social science contribution to climate change continues to outstrip their actual contribution. This morning I will discuss several topics related to this challenge and how we can meet it. I will discuss certainly, to start with, certain barriers within the social sciences to active participation in climate change research. I'll also give a quick and dirty, actually, assessment of where I think some of the most promising areas lie. And then finally, I want to discuss the consequences for the social sciences themselves if they take on this commitment to fully develop an interdisciplinary science of climate change. First of all, the barriers. There are well-known barriers to interdisciplinary climate research, to be sure, and you can all construct your list of some of the problems. Social scientists are wordier than physical scientists. They're too sensitive to small differences of time, space, and culture. They have too many disciplinary loyalties and even disciplinary jealousies, let's be candid, to participate in multidisciplinary ventures. And we can say similar things about the natural scientists. But we all recognize that none of these is an insurmountable barrier. These are intellectual and stylistic differences between scientific fields that ultimately can enrich the collaboration. But there are other kinds of barriers that have been actually harder to overcome. There has long been an ambivalence within the social science community toward climate change research. Although some social scientists have participated enthusiastically in climate research from the start, others objected to joining what were already fully defined research projects in which they felt social scientists served merely as scientific subordinates. The term that many social scientists used was handmaidens to the physical and biogeochemical scientists who were leading the research. Social scientists have argued that the climate scientists had initially defined the social science research agenda too narrowly, that what climate scientists believed they needed from social science already existed and was being taught in basic courses like Social Science 101. They objected to the idea that there isn't a new research agenda, that they were being asked to provide information but not to do research. And as a result of this, some social scientists, quite legitimately then, withdrew from that research area and avoided projects jointly with natural and physical scientists. Another barrier was the high entry threshold to research in climate and environmental change. Social science training, and indeed most research in the social sciences, is focused on social, behavioral, economic, and institutional interactions among humans. The 19th century focus on the physical environment and its social implications had faded by the 1950s and the 1960s, when the social sciences expanded so rapidly. With the advent of climate research and earth system science research in the late 1980s and the 1990s, few social scientists had sufficient background in the physical sciences either to usefully exchange research ideas with climate scientists or to identify what were flaws in their arguments vis-a-vis the social sciences. A third barrier was the discomfort that many social scientists felt with the idea that social science should provide the social or societal equivalent of engineering, should provide policy prescriptions for climate change. Many climate scientists suggest that the social science contribution to their work is policy. Policy concerns people, social scientists study people, ergo, social scientists should develop policy for climate change. There are two problems with this approach. The first is scientific. By emphasizing a policy contribution, we miss the basic research contribution. We ignore it. And that is that when we are studying anthropogenically induced climate change, we need to understand those behavioral forces and how they affect the physical and natural systems. But the second objection to this argument can be more serious. This reliance on the social sciences to induce or prescribe specific types of behavior goes counter to major currents in the history of the social sciences in the 20th century. For many social scientists, the history of their disciplines has encompassed a movement away from politically oriented social engineering and toward a more basic, and by implication, a more scientific kind of social science research. Social scientists have been burned by their association with policy in the past. And just avoiding some of the current controversies, let me just mention a few that will be familiar to you. The association of anthropology with colonial governments in the early 20th century. The U.S. Defense Department's use of research funding in Latin America as an instrument of foreign policy in Project Camelot. The justification of the imposition of apartheid in South Africa on social science grounds by social scientists in the government. And these are just a few. In short, the misuse of social science research, in which some social science scientists themselves participated, has led other social scientists to embrace a pure rather than applied approach to research that is distinctly at odds with what some climate scientists are now looking for in the social sciences. However, despite this ambivalence, social scientists can and do contribute to the field of climate change. We are very concerned about environmental degradation and the social impacts of climate change. We recognize the great potential significance of climate change to the Earth and to the Earth's inhabitants, and we want to do something about it. One consequence of the early barriers that I've been discussing here is that social scientists who were drawn to the field of climate change initially tried to create a purely social science research agenda for climate and environmental change, one that was scientifically divorced from the research agenda of the physical and biogeochemical scientists, just as the climate scientists themselves had divorced their research agenda in the early years from the social sciences. For some research topics, this social science-centric approach is legitimate and very valuable. However, by itself, it is inadequate to meet the needs that exist today. Moreover, for social scientists, as earlier for climate scientists, the disciplinary separatism ignores the fact that climate change is, in essence, a multifaceted, interdisciplinary problem that requires an understanding of the full range of interactions between Earth and its inhabitants. And this brings me to a fourth and a very serious barrier, which has nothing to do with ambivalence or misunderstandings or even the history of the social sciences. And I think this is almost certainly the major reason for the limited participation of the social sciences in this research worldwide. Social scientists have never had access to the levels of research funding that traditional climate scientists have had, with some notable exceptions. And here I must point out that our host country, Norway, has long led the way in providing equality of funding to social and physical scientists. But in other parts of the world, certainly in my country, that is not the case. In the United States, it is estimated that 98% of all climate research funding goes to the physical and biogeochemical sciences. This leaves 2%, which has to cover all of the social science research, plus data collection in the social sciences, plus education and postdocs and all the rest. This for a set of disciplines that everyone is claiming are central to progress in understanding climate change and dealing with it. Given these barriers, the major challenge that we face today is not whether the sciences of society are capable of making a major scientific contribution to climate change, but rather what can be done to unleash that contribution. How can we get it moving again? I would argue that social scientists must play a significant leadership role in interdisciplinary research planning. We can't bring social scientists in after the rules of the game have been set. Social scientists must take part from the start, and they must have sufficient funding in order to play this major role. My second topic this morning is to move sideways from the background of social science participation in climate research to the foreground. What are those areas of research that can contribute to what we're doing? And my emphasis here is going to be really on the human dimensions of climate change. There are many, many research agenda, and I think people in this room can contribute to it far more than I. We all have our litany of important research topics that need to be done. A recent report published by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, it came out in the past 2 weeks, entitled Restructuring the Federal Climate Research to Meet the Challenges of Climate Change, stressed the need, this is one of their top priorities, the need for anthropogenically oriented data and observations, including, and I quote here, time series data on human pressures on the environment, such as land cover and land use, resource extraction, energy consumption, pollutant emissions from different sources and sectors, and human attitudes, valuations, and responses. This very rich report also called for better data on human exposures to climate and environmental change, including morbidity and mortality data related to air and water quality. So they're thinking beyond the causes of climate change and moving right into the consequences of climate change, which is really very important. Now, this is something that social scientists can do very well. We have something to contribute here that other fields do not. We know how to collect social statistics. We know how to analyze these data. And very importantly, we know how to ensure the integrity of social statistics and social data in controversial policy environments. Another recommendation was that there be a significant increase in the financial support for social science research. And I think this is a line that has to accompany every discussion of social science and climate change. Without sufficient funding, we are going to be unable to mount the kind of research effort that is necessary to do the work that can provide the background, that can provide the research input that Dr. Pachuri was talking about. Other research priorities focused on the economics of carbon dioxide emissions, on response to and recovery from climate-induced and anthropogenically induced disasters, and so forth. Today, however, I want to talk very briefly about my own assessment of priority research areas. Not because my priorities are better than someone else's or more important than someone else's, but rather to start a conversation I think within the social science community, we need to start fresh thinking about what these priorities are. There are 3 areas that I think are particularly promising. These broad themes are firmly entrenched in the human dimensions tradition, and they also reach across that tradition to the needs of the physical sciences. My list includes cognitive and decision research, historical research, and examination of climate impacts in varying social and economic policy contexts. First, cognitive and decision research. I actually don't have to say too much about this. Dr. Pachuri talked about it. He certainly recognizes the importance of this. But there's a lot of new research going on in this area. There is research on information processing, in which we've learned that individuals process information in one of 2 ways. Either they process information based on analytic criteria, or they do so on more experiential criteria. This becomes important because of the importance of various kinds of assessments in communicating between the scientific community and the populations of our countries. The Ipcc remains the gold standard, and they have devoted a lot of attention to communication. But there are many other kinds of assessments. There's the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. There is a newly organized energy assessment. There are various national and regional assessments. And with all of these, there's information that needs to be conveyed to people. And when this information is conveyed, oftentimes the audience is seen as the highest level of decision makers, but we need to be thinking about ordinary person in the street. We need to be thinking about local government officials. And knowing something about how people process information will help us in communicating with these people. Knowing something about the fact that people generally have a finite pool of worries. That is, people can worry about a certain number of things and then they stop. We don't have an infinite capacity to worry about things. So we need to pick our targets carefully, is the lesson from that. Knowing that people have a bias toward taking a single action. When we are faced with an overwhelming problem, sometimes just doing one thing will relieve that worry, that sense of having to do something. So we need to be very careful in terms of what we ask people to do. For example, recycling is not going to be enough. It's important, but it shouldn't be we shouldn't allow people to feel totally comfortable now that they're recycling, that they are doing their part. There's more. There's more that we have to do. We also know much more about the ordering of arguments. We know something about the effect of defaults when we are outlining potential causes or potential courses of action. So this whole area is moving quickly. There's a lot of new research going on, and I think it holds great promise. My second priority area has to do with the uses of the past. The importance of an overtime approach to the study of climate and environmental change cannot be overemphasized. This, I thought, was going to be a radical statement, and I've heard innumerable people in the meetings here talk about the importance of history. So I guess I'm not making history here today at all, but I certainly agree with those people who are making that point. Climate decisions, behaviors, and impacts take place within and over time, and they are altered by time. Historical research provides a way to look at these patterns in time as they unfold, even though it is in the past. Much of the current social science research on climate impacts and adaptation is based on contemporary observation, contemporary laboratory studies, or prospective models that are actually based on a thin slice of time. My own work is focused on a historical analysis of climate-related behaviors in the Dakota Territory of the Northern Great Plains in the 19th century. Specifically, I'm looking at the first generation of white settlers in this area, roughly from the late 1870s to the turn of the century. These were people who had no experience with the climate extremes that they had to live through on the Great Plains. So they came to this area, and in rapid succession, they were subject to great drought, to flooding, to cyclones, to blizzards that actually shut down the access to food for over 6 months, to plagues of locusts, to wildfires. And that was just 1 year. This happened a lot. And what I'm doing is using these weather events as a surrogate, these extreme weather events as a surrogate for climate change, to understand what made people stay and how their decision to stay was influenced by other factors and what those factors were. In some ways, the past provides an alternative universe to test ideas that we develop about human dimensions in our own time. As the anthropologist Levi Strauss has written, no civilization can contemplate itself if it has no others for comparison. For the same reason, it's difficult to assess or to analyze impacts without the nuances that can be provided by comparison with other real situations in which real people had to make climate-related decisions. My third topic is the interaction between climate and socioeconomic institutions. We know that patterns of climate change can be highly varied. Sometimes they come through rapid change and extreme events. Sometimes the change is more gradual, and sometimes it is a combination of the two. These various patterns of change complicates our understanding of the impact on human societies, but we need to know more about these patterns and how they played out in other societies, in other places. For example, in the Dakota Territory, it was clear that the impact of extreme weather events was not nearly as important as social and economic policies. The fact that the U.S. national government had a policy of providing land for free to any farmer who would take up the land, stay there for 10 years, and build a small house was a strong inducement to stay. And the settlers lived through all of these extreme events, but kept thinking at the end of the line, they'll have their land, they'll have their farm. And they stayed through this area even though the climate was very different from the gentler, kindler climates that they had come from. Even seasonal change induced optimism in people. The snows melted, the spring rains came, and people were optimistic that the next season would be more benign. However, when there was a drought for 4 consecutive years, and the markets for agricultural products in the East began to decline, Dakota farmers departed for other more benign climates. In short, in that time and in that place, the influence of socioeconomic policies and institutions, the Morrill Land Act, for example, the economy that provided a market for their goods, trumped the importance of the climate events in their decision-making. But when climate conditions became worse, for longer periods of time, when these climate conditions were sustained over time, and when the socioeconomic policies did not respond to these changes, the population left for other places. I could add other research activities and methodologies to this list, but again, I want to be illustrative, not definitive, and I want to start the conversation, not even try to end it. I also want time to discuss the impact of all of this on the social sciences. And this is my third topic. How will the social sciences be changed if we take on the challenge to conduct interdisciplinary research on climate change? Assuming a more active leadership role in research planning for climate science will not be easy. Although the current climate research leadership believes in the importance of integrated interdisciplinary research and in social science participation in that research, social scientists do not have the same level of experience in climate research planning as their potential colleagues in the physical and biogeochemical sciences. If social scientists are to assume a stronger role in research planning, we will need a further set of changes in the social sciences, in the natural sciences, and in the funding structure for climate science. Social scientists must change some of their attitudes about the dominance of traditional disciplinary departments and research. Disciplinary institutions will remain important as a source of graduate and undergraduate training, as a source of research and of new hypotheses. But in the future, the traditional disciplines will be competing with interdisciplinary research. If we are going to advance the science of climate change, we need to strengthen our disciplinary bases at the same time as we broaden our interdisciplinary research and education. And this is a very, very difficult balance to make. The basic social science disciplines are the fields in which most human dimensions researchers are trained and start their scientific lives, but they spend those scientific lives in other areas. The process of obtaining training in one discipline and moving then to another discipline is already occurring in some places and is probably here to stay. The traditional disciplines need to broaden to incorporate new specialties and to provide new support for interdisciplinary research in order to keep the social sciences within the broad ambit of their original disciplines. We also need to engage in a massive new educational effort. We need to educate our physical science collaborators about the social sciences, and we need to learn more about the physical sciences. But going beyond this, we need to rethink the basis of graduate and undergraduate training throughout the climate sciences. Social science knowledge should be not limited to social scientists. I would not argue for dumbed-down courses in social science for climate scientists or for the reverse. But I do think that basic undergraduate social science courses, including courses in economics, demography, social statistics, and probably cognitive psychology and decision-making, should be required for all climate scientists. At the same time, social scientists should learn much more about the basic elements of physical and biogeochemical sciences as part of their training. We need to create a new career pipeline for social scientists doing human dimensions research. Students are attracted to the subject of climate change, to the subject of global environmental change, to the role of human agency in causing these. But we need many more research scientists who combine preparation in the human, physical, and biogeochemical sciences to address these issues. To create these interdisciplinary scientists, we need more fellowships and we need more postdocs. We have to acknowledge that people who do this research are going to have to spend more time in their graduate education because they're taking on more than one field. So it is a major commitment. Once this new core of cross-educated interdisciplinary research scientists is launched, we need to be ready to provide them with an institutional reward structure that is comparable in its breadth to the reward structure for traditional research. The new Journal of the American Meteorological Society, Weather, Climate, and Society, and other journals that are being launched this year, last year, next year, are a first step in that direction. As the editor of Weather, Climate, and Society, I obviously have a personal interest in its success. But the larger issue is that integrated interdisciplinary research must be published in multidisciplinary journals, and these journals should be attracting the best scientists. Similarly, publishing articles in interdisciplinary journals should be judged a very strong argument for hiring, tenure, and promotion. Career transitions for interdisciplinary climate science should be made easier. Publication is just one aspect of this. This is particularly important in the social sciences because there's no established career path for human dimension specialists. If support for hiring and promotion of interdisciplinary social scientists is not provided within the traditional disciplines, new interdisciplinary departments will form. and then the role of the traditional departments in the universities are likely to be diminished. So we need to work together. We need to develop these specialties hand in hand with the traditional disciplines, because there's a benefit to both. Solving the problem of underfunding for social science research on climate change is absolutely critical to meeting the scientific challenges posed by climate change. If the social sciences are to respond to the scientific challenges, it is essential that we can convince those who provide research funding to increase our research budgets, and those who support data collection, including satellite remote sensing and even non-satellite remote sensing, to increase their support for collecting data on human behaviors and on human impacts. We should enlist our colleagues in the physical sciences to work with us on increasing those research budgets, even if, as is very likely, some of those funds will come from the same pot as their own research funding. Meeting the challenge of climate change will not be easy. We have strong incentives and strong assets, including excellent social scientists who are already working in the field, and the commitment of ISSC and ICSU to maintaining the human dimensions of global change activity. But there is still a great deal more to do. Some of it involves crossing new research frontiers, which is exciting. And some of it involves slogging through the difficult institutional, educational, and research policy and funding changes that are going to be necessary if we meet this challenge. Some of it requires changes in the social science community, and some of it requires changes in the traditional climate science community. We have completed the first phase, which is getting social science research on the climate change agenda. Dedicated individuals have worked hard to show the value of social science for climate change research. In the next phase, social scientists must consolidate these gains, must find ways to provide the necessary fiscal and institutional support for integrated interdisciplinary research, and must take their rightful place within the leadership of research planning in this very important field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think both talks are quite complementary. The floor is open now for questions or comments from the audience. There is one microphone, and I would suggest that, because taking into account the time, that we collect 3 questions and then you can respond. So I have already Alberto question there. Okay, somebody is approaching to help us.
Thank you. Works now? Okay. Alberto Martinelli, University of Milan, Italy. I think that the IPCC is a success story of the way in which epistemic communities can play a key role in the governance of the basic issues of the global agenda. And the success is given to the fact that it had a very clear UN mandate. It is able to provide scientifically based findings, policy relevant, and to the fact that it has been able to involve governments already in the reviewing phase stopping at the point of defining concrete solutions, but leaving prescriptions to negotiation between political actors. My question to Professor Pachauri is, to what extent do you think that the Ipcc should involve more also other actors of the world civil society, NGOs, consumer associations, environmental movements, in not so much to provide policy relevant findings, although in this respect also, if we think to the different ways in which development models can be changed, but also in order to defining concrete solutions for achieving those common goals that you were referring at, like a more equitable distribution of resources, sharing cost, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. The next one.
My name is Ortwin Wren from the University of Stuttgart. Well, first, thanks very much for these very fascinating talks. I would like to address the issue of the barriers between the social scientists and the natural scientists, and I would like actually both of you to comment on this. In my experience, there are 3 additional barriers that were not mentioned, and I think they may have a large impact on this problem that you addressed. Number 1 is that social scientists have a plurality of theoretical concepts and knowledge claims, which is very legitimate. But in the eye of the policymaker and many natural scientists, it's like a supermarket, and you can find in the social science evidence for whatever you like. And that makes, of course, the social science sometimes appear arbitrary. The second point is the lack of quantification of causal modeling. When we worked with natural modelers in natural science, they always ask, where are your numbers? And of course, again, it's a problem to provide these numbers, not statistical numbers. It's really about modeling behavior, specifically institutional behavior. And do you feel that it's the same problem, that the number language, the mathematical language, is not being developed as much so that the cooperation can really be fruitful? And the last and third thing is that I see there's an epistemic divide between the majority of the natural scientists and maybe the majority of the social scientists in the way they look at what science produces. Natural scientists believe that they represent the real world and their natural laws that they discover. And social scientists believe in the construction of knowledge, they believe that there are competing narratives about the world. And this alienates most of the natural scientists quite a bit because they feel that their knowledge base is really taken into a doubt and being questioned. And that kind of epistemic divide very often seems to make communication between the 2 major science fields very difficult. And I would like to see if you agree that those are also 3 very major barriers and how you feel you can overcome them.
I'm Desmond McNeil from SUM, the Centre for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. Yesterday in one of the parallel sessions, Steve Rayner made the very important point, I think, that the gap is not so much between natural scientists and social scientists, because economists very often find it very easy to communicate with natural scientists and less with the rest of the social sciences. I'd like to relate that to the point in Dr. Pachauri's presentation about the discount rate. Because, as you know, but perhaps some of the other in the audience don't know, the Stern report used a discount rate of 1.4% as opposed to 6%. That was hugely controversial amongst economists. And the outcome of that is that the costs of climate change are 100 times that which is normally associated with the discount rate chosen by economists. So the degree of uncertainty is 100 times. So all the uncertainty relating to the physics pales into significance in relation to the question of how do we value future generations. And my point is that that decision, if you like, that choice should not be a technical choice left to economists. It's an ethical and political issue. You need, certainly in terms of research, you need to involve philosophers, political scientists, but ultimately it's a political decision. And the idea that it actually is a technical question of uncertainty about the discount rate has to be replaced, I think, by a different statement, a framing of the question. Thank you.
Yeah, now I invite both for answering. I'm so sorry, but if you could keep the answers short, because I think I would like to take another second round of 3 other speakers.
Thank you. Well, let me quickly respond to these three questions. The ones that I found difficult, I'll leave to you if you agree. Well, let me address the first question. We do involve other actors. Just to give you an example, and we're doing that quite systematically now. Even in the plenary sessions of the IPCC, we do have organizations, civil society in particular, come there as observers on an observer status. So I think that's happening on a much larger scale than was the case earlier. I might also mention that even in some of our meetings where we are working on specific reports, we involve, for instance, industry. If you're dealing with technology issues, there's no better place to go for expertise and knowledge than to those who actually develop and implement technological solutions. So we're doing that. Perhaps there's much more to be done. Finally, may I also mention that when it comes to spreading the message and dissemination of our results, we work with partner organizations. And that really depends on their degree of enthusiasm, which sometimes is high, sometimes it's not. On the issue of discount rate, may I say that the IPCC functions on the basis of peer-reviewed literature. And I think that's an extremely important characteristic of our work, because that ensures that you get a whole range of, excuse me. Let me come back to this later.
Okay. I think what I'll do is respond to the middle comments by Orwin Wren, which are very good comments. I think that the three issues that he raised also do contribute to the barriers. I don't think they are insurmountable barriers, however, just as I don't think the other barriers that I mentioned were insurmountable as well. I think it's important to identify these barriers and to address them. In terms of the plurality of theoretical outlooks, certainly not every social scientist is going to become a climate scientist, and those with theoretical outlets that simply don't fit into the climate change research activity are probably not going to be a part of it. In terms of the epistemic divide within the social sciences and between the social sciences and the climate scientists, I know that this has been a problem, and physical scientists look at social scientists sometimes in disbelief that there is this divide and this belief in the social construction of knowledge. I guess I would take refuge in the I think it's something that can be overcome again, and I think I would take refuge in the American philosopher George Santayana, who said, there is no God, and Mary is his mother.
Okay, let me get back. Sorry about that problem with my throat, which dries up often when one talks too much, which I do all the time. Well, I was just going to say that one major strength of the IPCC is that we go by peer-reviewed literature. And therefore, there's really no scope for subjectivity in deciding on, let's say, something as crucial as the discount rate. I believe that it's critically important that when it comes to social science research related to climate change, that you get a wide range of scenarios, you get a wide range of variables in defining what possible solutions would be. I have a lot of respect for what the Stern report has done, but I do believe in this respect they perhaps could have done a lot more. I also want to mention that in the case of the second question that was asked, just a brief comment. I think it's extremely important that when social science research is going to be carried out on climate change, that we go beyond concepts and there has to be an empirical base. Because in the absence of that, there would be a mismatch between what physical scientists do and what social scientists are going to. And I think there's a fair amount of work that's quite quantitative, that's quite empirical in the social sciences. We just need to make sure that we come up with a proper matching of these two sets of philosophies and approaches.
Okay, because the time is short, we have to look for a compromise because we're already in our lunch break. So 3 more questions here in front, very short questions. And yeah, maybe there's a woman. Sorry for those in the, yeah, please come. For those in the back, and maybe you have a little bit of time also to talk. Okay.
In Paris. It doesn't work?
You
And
have
now
to
it
come
works?
closer,
Ah,
like
excuse
it's
me.
like
Michel
operation.
Vieviorca, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. I have 2 very brief, huge and brief questions. The first one is, it's clear that if we don't face these huge issues, there will be terrible problems. So our first attitude is defensive. My question would be, couldn't we have also a more offensive attitude facing these issues? Taking seriously, for instance, the idea of developing new areas, the idea of reducing social inequalities, and so on. Isn't it possible to give a more offensive dimension? First question. And my second question is, in the list of obstacles for social scientists, don't you think that the fact, I will use Ulrich Beck's words, which are very good, when he speaks of methodological nationalism, the fact that social science very often think in, or used to think in terms of the frameworks of the nation state, don't you think it's a very also important obstacle? Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thank you for your interesting talks. I'm Gaston Beskus from the University of Brussels and SEKC in Belgium. I would like to share an experience also from the climate change workflow, so to speak. A few years ago, I think it was 5 years ago, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat asked researchers to establish a constituency of research-oriented non-governmental organizations. And as I was one of the early members of that, I was asked to write a kind of a vision note on how the research community on the platform of the climate change conferences could work better within the process itself. So not only at the meetings, but also in between. And we had long discussions on, scientists come there with different interests, of course, and we had long discussions on what really joins us, and then we come up with a statement that we want to deliver good science for better policy making. And of course, then I described what this could be. You have the classics, it's transdisciplinarity, inclusiveness, but also with regard to the message. And I would think we need some kind of reflexivity also on that platform in terms of pointing at what science can do, but also what science cannot do. And I don't mean that negative. It's we all know that the problem with governance processes that have to deal with inherent uncertainties and complexities such as these, they have to generate trust while they have to deal with and be steered by opinions that cannot be turned into facts. And I think the social sciences could really contribute in generating this kind of trust also there. So beyond positionism, I would like to say. And especially to Professor Ballstadt, I think raising awareness is among ourselves is not enough. The UN Secretariat should also give a sign to the research community that this kind of approach is also needed. Otherwise, simply said, social scientists don't come, or they only come as consultants, so to speak. So the UN should give a sign, and probably also in these early stages motivate and steer this transdisciplinary process a little bit in the beginning to get it going on.
Thank you. I ask the next speaker.
My name is Ingrid Eide. I'm retired from the University of Oslo and in and out of politics, let me admit that. I'm very grateful for the breadth, the range of your interventions. And I was thinking, Dr. Balstad, that you referred to the pool of worry as a kind of limited resource. And I was thinking, how could you advise us and how could we research on the most efficient, effective use of that limited pool of worry? And how can we avoid worry fatigue when worry fatigue is really necessary to motivate action? And I think one way to diminish worry fatigue would be to do exactly what Dr. Pachauri did towards the end, showing what is possible to meet some of the challenges. Then secondly, if I may, some of us, I guess, have been involved in the prevention of nuclear war. Mutually assured destruction had a low probability, but a dramatic effect. Here we are, in a way, facing the opposite, namely something that has a high probability, but a sneaking effect. And how is that a different situation? And would you, in your research agenda, include, for instance, different types of threats throughout history and how we have coped, including with the, hopefully, prevention of nuclear war? Thank you.
So thank you very much. I invite you now for your final statement or answers, including the answers to the questions.
Well, I just make two quick comments on, firstly, on what you referred to as the offensive approach. I think that's absolutely essential. It's not enough to treat climate change as an isolated target to be tackled, to be attacked. The basic problem is that we have in the world today an unsustainable pattern of growth, and climate change is only a symptom of that. And therefore, if we want to bring about change, if we want to ensure that the risks that climate change carries can be minimized, if not eliminated, over a period of time, we really have to bring about some very basic changes. And I think even the current economic crisis that we're going through gives us that kind of opportunity to look at the basic and fundamental flaws in the system. So I hope this will happen on a larger scale than we've seen in the past. The second point I'd like to make is in response to the comment of looking at what science cannot do. We're trying to do that, and I believe there's a lot more that perhaps we should do. Science has its limitations, and I think beyond a point, there are other considerations that have to take over. For instance, I mentioned the fact that science cannot define what represents a dangerous level of anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That's something which social scientists, philosophers, thinkers have to do. They have to tackle this issue. What is dangerous for the world could very well be coincidental with what is dangerous for some of the lowest lying areas on this planet. And I don't think you can come up with something that is an average to define what is dangerous. What's dangerous for one part of, even a small part of this global community, is dangerous for the community as a whole. And I think these are some of the areas where social scientists should get involved, because I'm afraid scientists, I'm talking of the IPCC, climate scientists, cannot really tackle some of these issues. It's beyond our means to define what represents dangerous. And there are other issues also where science clearly has some limitations, but there are other disciplines that must take over them.
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick. In terms of optimism and looking at the current crisis as a way to somehow accomplish more things, I am reminded of a statement by President Obama's chief of staff: never waste a crisis. We need to take advantage of where we are right now to move ahead. And the idea that social science research has been traditionally focused on the nation state is important to raise. And I think one of the ways that we have to broaden our approach is to go beyond the nation state and even beyond political jurisdictions. They are important for some kinds of research because it's in political jurisdictions that political regulations and policy are formed. But not always. The human impact on the environment, human forcing functions, are often don't fall in nicely into political jurisdictions. One of the things that we have done at Columbia is develop a global map on a 1 kilometer scale of population, so that you can look at population pressures regardless of whether those people are in a particular country. And that begins to free us from the tyranny of the nation state analytically, and in certain areas can move us beyond that. As far as the reflection on what science cannot do, as far as looking at how we avoid worry fatigue and how we somehow order priorities, these are very important, and that's exactly what I'd hoped we would do here today, begin to talk about that emerging research agenda. So I thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you to the both speakers. But thank you also to the audience because of your patience, your interest, your good questions, and apologies for all those that did not have the opportunity to ask the questions. As usual, we leave with more questions than answers, but that's science. Thank you.